For the vast majority of human history, music did not exist as a fixed medium art form, the same way that, say, literature did, for example. There's almost no difference between the art of literature itself and then the medium through which it is conveyed. In other words, if you want to read a book, all you have to do is, well, read the book. The words are right there on the page, and then you're going to be enjoying the literature as it is. This is similar to art forms like sculpture or painting or film, where the end result gives you a piece of art which is entirely tied to a medium. Until the advent of sound recording, music was a very different art form. You could interpret music off of the page, but it would need to be physically realized in order to actually be experienced. Well-trained musicians can experience music through something called audiation, which is the ability to actually hear music in your head as you're reading sheet music, but for regular people, you need to actually have it physically performed in order for it to make any sense. Yes, because of sheet music, we have a good idea what the music of Mozart sounded like, but we can never know it as intimately as, say, the sculpture of Michelangelo. It survived the ages because it was affixed to the physical medium of marble, whereas the actual music of Mozart, as it was performed in the 18th century, is ephemeral and was completely lost to the sands of time. The art of theater is very similar. All we have of Shakespeare's craft are the written words and stage directions of his plays, so we can never truly experience the same experience that 17th century patrons of the Globe Theater had. The entire art form of music radically changed with the advent of sound recordings at the turn of the 20th century. With sound recording, you could actually capture the entire performance of a piece of music, whereas previously you had to rely upon instructions on actually how to perform that piece of music. You could also now alter the performance through edits and overdubs and even musical synthesis. Music now had the ability to genuinely become a fixed medium art form. Now, a big advantage of sound recording on top of this is that composers and musicians could focus on sounds first and foremost. Instead of previously where you had to painstakingly notate all the details in order to create a certain sound, musicians can now simply record that sound, completely bypassing the need for sheet music. This has led to generations of musicians with very broad sonic palettes and also a very different kind of outlook and mindset on creating music than previous generations did when they had to rely upon music notation for everything. This is the disconnect. Because the only surviving record of the music of Western composers of the past 400 years or so has been in their sheet music, musical academia has vastly inflated the importance of written music. It's a unique problem to music in general. Remember the comparison to theater? Directing, stage design, and acting, of course, all have very important roles to play in theater, but for whatever reason, musical academia has decided that the written note is more important than the actual performed note. Essentially, musicians are often judged based upon their ability to play exactly what's on a piece of paper. For composers, it's much more about the process that went into making the music rather than the music itself. I call this the cult of the written score, and it's pervasive in all forms of academic and collegiate thought. At its most extreme, the cult of the written score gives us music that is really boring. Extremely boring. More interested in the mathematical thought and the processes necessary to make 12-tone composition or pitch cell composition, people in the musical ivory tower genuinely forget to make music. Most of it's totally boring with no sense of drama or arc or texture or anything. The process of writing the music and how they can connect the dots is given way more importance than the actual act of listening to music and creating music that's exciting or interesting, kind of forgetting the reason why we like to make music in the first place. Which, according to science, is to have a lot of sex. I call this kind of music making correct music making, and of course I mean that in the most derogatory way possible. However, the cult of the written score has given rise to something called the graphic score. Looking to push boundaries, new composers have figured out interesting ways of warping standard musical notation and adding new symbols and gestures to create novel approaches to reading music off of a sheet of paper. This is why in his TED Talk, composer Mark Applebaum considers himself a graphic artist in addition to a composer because of the unusual nature of the scores that he creates. Graphic scores still put an emphasis on the process of making music, but let's be honest, it's a little bit more fun to try and figure out what these symbols mean. Remember, when you play music, you play music. It's supposed to be a fun endeavor. The extreme emphasis on the written music also gives rise to a little-known pastime, which is one of my favorites, and that is reading music along with listening to music. It's actually quite exciting to see the music fly by in real time, kind of like a lyric video, except way more detailed and far more insightful. My mother grew up in a very musical family, and after dinner, instead of watching TV or whatever, the family would get around communally and read scores to orchestral pieces. It wasn't until later on in her life where she realized that wasn't typical American family behavior. So for better or worse, there's a major emphasis on written music at the collegiate and academic level, especially in classical and jazz music, but other musics as well. I ran into this sort of problem last year when I was applying for the ASCAP Herb Alpert Jazz Composers Award, where I was writing a big band piece that incorporated a lot of electronic music elements. I was tempted to submit the score of just the jazz big band elements to the award committee because it was very difficult to notate some of these electronic parts, but I gave it a shot anyway. I felt like notating these elements could give some context to these academic musicians who had absolutely no frame of reference for popular electronic music styles. Now, for the example of this that I'm about to play you, there's kind of an unusual texture. There's a 5-string bass and a 7-string guitar that are both drop tuned to A. There's also 4 trombones which are playing parallel major 7th voicings, and there's also a very aggressive sort of dubstep style synth bass sound. In notating how this program's synth sounds, I not only included the fundamental pitch, but also some lanes of automation, which describe how the sound of the synth changes over time. The automation parameters include things like filter cutoff, and also volumes and pitches of additional oscillators which control the bass oscillator using something called frequency modulation or FM synthesis. Check it out. To somebody who has absolutely no concept of what goes into making these sounds, this form of notation hopefully sheds some light into the process of actually making the music. Much the same way that my mom, reading those orchestral scores in her family's living room, had some insight into the music of Beethoven. It's through this lens that I don't see the cult of the written score being a completely bad thing, per se. It just requires a different mindset among musicians who wish to educate an entrenched elite about more modern music that doesn't necessarily have a tradition yet of written sheet music. I honestly see this entering the lexicon of music academia in the next, 10 or 15 years as more and more people want to share their processes of making this modern music. If, as an electronic music artist, or a hip-hop artist, or a rock musician, or pop musician, or what have you, you're able to describe the way that you sculpt your sounds, which are intrinsic to the value of the music itself, you'll be able to educate people who are completely oblivious to what they're hearing. And then hopefully you'll be able to get them to have some newfound appreciation for your music, or at the very least, some respect for your music. And at the very least, it will look impressive, which, sorry to say, that's the most important thing for a lot of sorts of institutions of higher learning. Incidentally, I did get that ASCAP Jazz Composers Award, so yes, electronic music can be accepted in the academic community so long as you appeal to the cult of the written score and show them exactly what you did in order to create that music in written sheet music notation. As long as you appeal to the cult of the written score, you'll be fine no matter what kind of music you make if you decide to go on at the college level in music. This has been Adam Neely. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please comment, like, and subscribe. And yeah, peace.